So we'll get started. Welcome everybody to another TMC Connect partner webinar. I'm Melanie Thomas, and I am very pleased to have with me our preferred partner, MQMR, and Scott Weintraub, who is Vice President of Growth Solutions, and Joseph Rhodes, Compliance Specialist at Willow Bend Mortgage. And they're here to discuss taming the third-party web, AI spreadsheets, and vendor blind spots. And before I hand it over to Scott, I just have a couple of housekeeping items. Everybody on this webinar today, you've been muted because this is being recorded, but please, if you have any questions, drop them in the chat and we'll make sure and get to them. And also everybody registered for this webinar, you will be getting a recording of it later this week. So stay tuned along with a copy of this slide deck. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Scott.
Melanie, thanks so much. Thanks to you and TMC for organizing this and for inviting Joseph and I to be a part of it. We're so grateful. And thanks to everyone for joining. We are grateful to have you with us and happy to talk to you about this really important topic that is not only emerging in its scrutiny, but really has always been on the forefront of minds with regulators, but more importantly, can really help your organization operate more efficiently, more effectively, and more compliantly. And that is the goal of the 30 minutes that we have today. We want to talk with you about not only what vendor management is, why it's important, but also to bring some real world, how does this work, or how can it work well at a company? So as a partner, I'll be providing you with some knowledge, but also we have from a lender, Joseph Rhodes from Willow Bend, as Melanie said. And Joseph, so happy to have you on joining me. How are you?
Thank you, Scott. Doing great.
So glad to have you as part of our conversation. And I know that's what this 30 minutes is going to be, a dialogue really and a conversation between us. There are a few slides, as you can see. And as Melanie said, you all will get the slides after the webinar. And if you do have questions at any time, please drop them in the chat. If we have time, a half hour from now, at the end, Joseph and I will try to get to them. But if we can't, rest assured that in the follow-up email and communications that you get, we will answer any questions in there that we don't get to today and give you all that information. And of course, one or both of us would be happy to have conversations with you individually after this webinar today. So with that, let's get into what we're calling taming the third-party web. And it can be a tangled web, as I know Joseph knows, so we're going to talk about that over the next half hour. But Joseph, we're going to channel our inner Spider-Man and untangle this tangled web. So with that, I think we want to start at where we are now. So what's the current state of vendor management, what it means for all of you, and what is the focus of it from regulators? So it used to be, back in the day, perhaps simpler, right? I think vendor management, if you have a lot of vendors that are working for you as a lender or servicer or both, it could be complicated, or trying to manage successfully all of the different vendors that you have, whether it was with a spreadsheet or however you were doing it. It's even more complicated today. Right? Because not only are there things like an LOS or your servicing system of record, there are all types of other vendors. And even within your process, you could have an LOS, you could have a separate system that's creating your documents. You could have a separate system that's helping you with things like e-closings. So really, even within a system that's a vendor, there could be multiple vendors at play as part of your operational structure. And there's things such as AI. And we're going to talk about AI a little bit later in the webinar. So what does it mean? It means this is something that is a big focus for regulators, especially lately with the proliferation of vendors that companies are using, and especially with AI, right? So for example, at your companies where you're sitting right now, there could be AI that you're using for underwriting on the origination side, or maybe even for loss mitigation on the servicing side. You could be using chatbots for any of a number of reasons. You could be using them for advertising and marketing. And regulators want to know what robust and comprehensive management and oversight you have over those vendors. And with that, Joseph, I think this is a good time to bring you in for my first question for you, which is, in your experience at Willow Bend, what has, either from a regulator at a state or from agencies, the GSEs, what has your experience been like with regulators or examiners specifically related to vendor management?
I like to
Yeah,
discuss it in a timeline that I like to call
yeah.
before MQMR and then post MQMR. And in the before MQMR days, around 2023, we got audited by Fannie Mae. And most of the audit was going well until we got to vendor management. And then they gave us the finding that we did not have a robust vendor management program that meets their requirements. And that really started the conversation of, well, what are we missing? And back in those days, I will admit, we were let's take all of our vendors and put them on a spreadsheet, and that'll be the end of that. And like, we're good to go. Of course, once Fannie Mae said that that's not going to cut it, we realized we needed to improve that. And then MQMR was a good option for us because it essentially takes all of the tasks that take up so much of my time: contract review, reviewing due diligence questionnaires, all of that. It's a huge time saver because I'm no longer having to do that one by one, but I'm able to get assistance from MQMR into performing those tasks for me and giving me those risk reports.
Joseph, I love that. And obviously, it's great feedback for us to hear. But I think even more importantly than that, that your company was in a situation where you had this exam or this audit, and were told, what you were doing is in some form or fashion less than what they were expecting or what they would consider to be appropriate for the type of company you are, the number of vendors that you have, and in particular,
Yeah.
the types of information to which those vendors had access, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to talk a lot more about what your experience has been like in that post that you said, the PM, post MQMR, as we go through this webinar. But it's great to hear that that solution for you was successful, right?
Yes.
In other words, was successful with what the regulator was expecting. And when you have exams and audits going forward, you won't have that issue that you had in 2023. As we go forward over the next 20 minutes or so, what I want to talk more about is actually what it's meant and what the benefits are for your company beyond being audit ready. Being audit ready is great, but we could also get into what it's meant for your company and really, and for you in particular, working in compliance for Willow Bend. So Thanks for that. And so, let's go the other way. And okay, so if your company is or was in a position like what Joseph's was back in 2023, you might have had what we called some blind spots. As Joseph mentioned, if the way your company might be managing vendors is trying to have them all on a spreadsheet or trying to remember to go and do your due diligence on an ongoing basis and giving feedback to a vendor if there's ever an issue, if all of that is manual, that could lead to things being missed. And so what we want to talk about over the next few minutes are what some of these blind spots can be if it's something that you're trying to do in somewhat of a manual fashion or trying to do it all by yourself. So the first thing, one of the traps is it's really important to tier your vendors and to think about the types of risk that they present to your organization. For example, if you try to treat every vendor the same or try to treat every vendor as the highest tier vendor or the highest level of risk, that means you're really not going to have enough time to manage any of them well, right? So instead, and Joseph, I think you can talk about this in a second, one of the things that we help companies with is looking at your vendors. So starting from a holistic view, who are all the vendors that your company uses, but then strategically tiering those vendors, right? So you can see here, there are 3 tiers of vendors that you can rank your organizations that you work with in. So for example, a low tier vendor, such as maybe the janitorial staff that might come in, or a vendor that comes in and brings you coffee. They're a vendor, they provide you with something, but the impact on your company with a vendor like that is different than the vendor who is your LOS system, right? I think we'd all agree those are 2 different levels of risk, among many other things. Your LOS vendor has access to all of the information about your borrowers, right? All their NPI, all their PPI, all of that information. So that would be what would be considered a high risk vendor, right? If their failure, it could halt your operations. I imagine, Joseph, if your LOS went out, that would be not good, right? For a
Oh,
variety of
yeah.
reasons, right? So,
Okay.
Joseph, can you talk to us a little? So this is great to say in theory, your vendors should be tiered and you should look at them strategically and do oversight based on risk. Can you talk a little bit about how your relationship works with MQMR and how your vendors are reviewed?
Yeah. So basically, when we first started our relationship, they wanted a quick accounting of our vendors and how we viewed them. And I think this also expresses the importance of MQMR is that we may not necessarily have assigned tier one risk to
Mm,
certain vendors that maybe we should have. And in speaking with MQMR, they would advise us, hey, this system or this software that you're using because it contains borrowers NPI, you might want to put it in a tier one risk category as opposed to a tier three or a tier two. So not only did they help us get our vendors organized into these tiers, but they also advised us on ones that maybe we initially didn't quite have right. And after speaking with the geniuses at MQMR, especially the person I worked with most, Nick Joyce, we were able to kind of get those tamped down to where they're supposed to be in either tier one, two, or three.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Joseph. And I think one of the things that's important is, this is something that we recommend that every company does, right? To
Yeah.
think about your vendors strategically and determine what the level of risk is. That's crucially important as we go on and talk about what the level of oversight is that's needed, because again, it's not the same for every type of vendor. And a regulator or an examiner is going to expect a higher level of oversight, for example, with your LOS than with other vendors who are not at that level of risk. And for companies that choose to use a third party like MQMR, one of the things, Joseph, that I know you've talked about with us is what we've been able to see industry wide, right? From all the companies that we work with and what those best practices are. And so we'll get into those as we continue over the next 15 minutes or so. But that's the major point of this slide. If you're not looking at your vendors and ranking them and tiering them according to the level of risk that they provide to your organization, it could lead to you missing something, right? And that's what we don't want. We don't want your companies missing something. So from there, let's get into what Joseph and I were just talking about, which is what type of oversight do you need? And again, when we talk about this, there's two reasons for it. Number one, we've mentioned what auditors and regulators are going to be expecting. That's important, right? We want all of you to now be in the situation that Joseph's company is in, which is when they look at vendor management, they're going to see what Willow Bend is doing and they're going to quickly move on to the next area, which is the best possible result, right? No time spent on that issue at all, right? But that's reason one of two. The other reason that's equally or more important is the better your vendor management is, the more effectively your company will operate because you'll see issues if they're there. And if there are things that could cause, for example, consumer complaints. It could cause refunds to have to be made to borrowers, and all of those things could cause reputational harm. So I'm going to give you a quick example. Imagine you're a servicer servicing thousands or tens of thousands of borrowers with loans. Most servicers use a vendor to help pay property taxes on behalf of borrowers. Stories that I've heard over the years, as an example, have been, well, what if a company changes vendors from one to another, right? And that happens, and either without the process being followed as much as it could have been when that change was made to a new vendor, maybe not doing as much diligence on that new vendor as you could have. The stories I've heard, as an example, are that new vendor, there was some sort of glitch and not all of the borrowers got their property taxes paid. And so you can imagine how many different issues that created for the organization. And one with better oversight and management over vendors could have been prevented, right? So Joseph, for example, either going back to your pre-MQMR days, or I imagine stories like that, either maybe not necessarily your company, but things that you've heard about what can happen if you don't have something robust in place.
Right. Yeah, and essentially it comes down to active monitoring. And there's
Yeah.
not a whole lot of active monitoring being done if all your vendors are just sitting on a spreadsheet.
Mm.
And that's really, how much help we got from MQMR is essentially it's not only covering essential tasks that need to be done for an effective vendor management program, but also to improve well past just the monitoring and contract review. Setting up reminders for whenever contracts are about to come due. MQMR can help you do all of these things. It's also a great platform to store the contracts themselves, as opposed to just putting them in a folder on your desktop somewhere. MQMR employs the use of vendorrisk.com, which is a great platform to record all of your contracts so that you can quickly pull them up. You can quickly see when due dates are coming. And, if you need to, for instance, issue an amendment to those contracts before they come due. That way you can, improve anything that you might be lacking. A big one for us was before we had MQMR, we were not requiring any of our vendors to alert us in the event of a cybersecurity breach. And so after seeing that finding on several risk reports from MQMR, we started including that in our new updated contracts.
Joseph, that's fantastic information. So thank you for sharing that. I want to follow up on everything you said was really important, but I want to follow up on two things in particular. The first is, you mentioned one of the things that you get from MQMR are notifications about when things in a contract are due, such as a renewal and things of that nature. And those renewals often say you must tell us if you don't want to renew, right, 30 days in advance or 60 days in advance of the renewal date. That, Joseph, is something I hear from talking to companies all the time, that they are stuck in a contract with a vendor that they don't like, that is not performing well, and either they're stuck in it for another year, or maybe they're stuck in it for another 2 or 3 years. And in order to get out of it, they'd have to pay a lot of money for services that they won't be getting any longer because they missed the renewal period. That's a really important point that you made. Again, we hear that all the time. And you're right. It's absolutely something that we can help with. I would add one corollary even to what you said, which is that what I also hear from companies a lot is that they have vendor contracts and they don't even fully know what's in them, right? So the renewal period is one part of it, but they don't even know fully what all of the services are or aren't that they have with that vendor, right? So that could lead to two consequences, both of which would be less than ideal. One would be there might be a service that a company thinks they have with a vendor that they don't, that actually isn't included in the contract, and thus they'd have to pay extra for it if they want. Or there might be a service that is included as part of the agreement between the lender or servicer and the vendor, and the company didn't know, right? And for however long they've been in their relationship, they could have been taking advantage of a service. They're paying for it, right? Part of what they're paying is for that service, and they're not utilizing it. Joseph, we hear both ends of that spectrum all the time. And I think you're right. Having someone, especially who could look at it from that independent outside view, will be able to say, look, this is what your contract says. Are you using all of these things, right? Number one. And number two, yeah, this renewal's coming up, right? 30 days from now, you have to tell them if you want to renew or not, so that the company has time to make that informed decision. The other thing that you mentioned right at the end was something like cyber, as an example. If there are other areas in addition to vendor management that are really key areas of focus for regulators and examiners, it is cybersecurity and information and data security. I will tell you, and I imagine many of you on this call who've been going through exams, particularly at the state level, but also at the GSE level, have probably encountered, instead of a question or two related to IT and data security and cybersecurity, you have likely encountered pages and pages full of questions related to cybersecurity and information and data security. And those questions aren't just about for example, what is Willow Bend doing to keep, website, cybersecurity and information and data secure? They are asking what Willow Bend is doing, but they would also be asking Willow Bend, what are you doing with your vendors, right? Who have information about your borrowers, for example. What are you doing to make sure they have cybersecurity controls in place and information and data security policies, procedures, and controls in place? So, Joseph, it was so great that you pointed that out, that was an actual add to your process, present
Yes.
tense from then and future tense going forward, so that you'll have that protection, again, not only to satisfy regulators, that's great, but also in the event that something happens, that you'll be notified, that you'll be able to help make sure the issue is hopefully stopped as soon as possible and that things are corrected. You can't do any of those things if you're not notified. That's the biggest thing.
Okay.
So that's been a great ad. Okay. And we have a few minutes left. So let's look at what we're calling blind spot number 3, and that's AI. Joseph and I mentioned about 20 minutes ago at the beginning of the webinar that that's one of the things that's new or newer related to mortgage origination, mortgage servicing, and in particular related to this webinar today, vendor management. And what I mean by that is a lot of vendors that lenders and servicers are currently using use AI, right? And so what did I put at the top? The trap, that is, there may be vendors of yours that you're using that might be using AI and you don't even know it, right? Similar to what Joseph and I were just talking about, if there's nothing that makes them tell you if there's a data breach, one might have happened and you wouldn't know it. It's similar with AI in that a vendor might be using AI for some or a lot of the services that they're providing to you, and you might not know. So to Joseph's point earlier about cyber, this is another good thing to make sure is in your contracts. And that as part of your ongoing diligence, you were talking about with your vendors, starting with as simple as, are you using AI? And if the answer is yes, a good follow-up question is how, or in what ways are you using AI? And then that can lead to things you will want to request from your vendors. Things such as what policies and procedures and controls are there related to the AI tools that you have, that we're using as a lender and servicer? What testing do you do of the inputs into that AI to make sure there aren't biases or that hallucinations are limited? And how often is that testing done? And so we've talked about what some of the fixes are, right? Updating your questionnaires that are sent to your vendors and updating what's in your contracts. So to that point, Joseph, to bring you back in, even more generally, or maybe specifically to AI, but when you're in your relationship with MQMR and they're looking at your vendors, can you talk to us a little bit about what's the output that you get? What does that look like? Like, what do you get back? You've talked a lot about how MQMR reviews the vendors. What's some of the output that you get?
So yeah, essentially when they provide these detailed risk reviews, like they will get in depth in terms of data security. If there is AI use, how is it being used? Is it something that can be effectively audited? Can they provide audit logs, for their AI that they're using? And so these are things that either, if we weren't already looking at them in QMR, enabled us to put that at the top of our list, especially with vendors these days that are incorporating AI into their programs, and making sure that's something that we are aware of and that it's being reviewed.
Joseph, I love that. And, I think that's a great lead in to, I know we have just a few minutes left. Sort of the last question that I wanted to ask you for today is, let's look now at what your current state is and what your future state will be with this relationship that you now have. We've just gone through, over the last 25 or so minutes, how important vendor management is and what some of the blind spots can be without a robust, comprehensive system in place for oversight and management of vendors. Your company, Joseph, has that in place now. So your blind spots have gone down to 0. which is fantastic, again, for the two reasons that we mentioned. Not only because of how audit ready Willow Bend is now, but also because of how much more effective it is. And you're able to find out if there are red flags or even yellow flags with any of your vendors. And you, Joseph, and whoever at your company uses that vendor, right? Operations or sales, whoever, you and them can do something about it and take action, right? Up to and including changing a vendor out, right? Depending on what the issues are. And if the vendor can't commit to you that they're going to fix them to be compliant or effective or both, right? But the last point I'd like you to talk to us a little bit about, Joseph, is the benefit to you personally, right? You mentioned that this job used to be something you were doing or trying to do as best as one could all by yourself, right? Because of not only the relationship that you have with MQMR, but all of the things that we've talked about, that what they do, what has that meant for you and your ability to do other things for the benefit of your company?
So yeah, it's essentially a massive time saver without sacrificing oversight of vendor management. I still have control. I can still communicate with MQMR about certain things that we want. If there's a vendor we'd like to push up the audit schedule, things like that. So I'm able to execute full control over our vendor management program with the help of MQMR, but it's no longer something that's taking up so much of my time. So instead of all the time that I spend, in contract review, I can finally start going back to updating policies and procedures so they stand up to audit. That's always a big one for me. Every time I find myself with free time, I know exactly what I could be doing with that, and that's updating policies and procedures.
I love that, Joseph. And again, let's think of the multiple benefits of just that one piece that you mentioned. I know from my experience, having worked at lenders or servicers before coming to MQMR, and obviously over the last 6.5 years at MQMR, when an auditor comes out, the policies and procedures are always the items that they request first, right? Not in the middle or at the end. Policies and procedures are always requested first, because if a company doesn't have solid and robust policies and procedures, then the regulator and examiner will know, well, then there could be issues all the way down the line, right? In other words, if there aren't good policies and procedures, they know what the answers are going to be to all of the other questions that they're going to ask next. So that's why I think rightly they ask for policies and procedures first. But again, leaving the audits and exams, of which I'm sure there are many that Willow Bend has and is going through, having robust policies and procedures helps your company operate better. And that's something you need, even if you never have an exam from anyone, right? So with that, again, you're all going to get all of these slides that are going to come out after. We put a few things on here that can help with sort of a checklist, or these are the big areas that you want to focus on. And it'll have my information on it as well. And so I just want to make sure that all of you know, I'm going to stop sharing for a second and just see if there might be anything. Melanie, do you know if there's anything in any questions in the chat? Okay.
There's no questions. You're that good, Scott.
Thank you so much, Melanie. But we will be sending out a follow-up with these slides so you can have this information. And again, please feel free to reach out anytime if you want to talk about your vendor management system, or if you want to bounce any ideas off us and want to talk about how you can get help with having your system, again, not only stand up to regulator scrutiny, but to help your company operate better, which is, if there's anything more important to exams, it's that. This can be a win for your organization, and it can turn vendor management from something that could be a liability or a time suck, as Joseph mentioned, into a competitive advantage for your company. So with that, Melanie, thanks again for having us, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
No, that was perfect. Thanks so much, guys. And thanks everyone who joined, and we'll take care and see you soon. Take care.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Yes.